Here follows an extract from my book Artful Designs, available from Amazon. Chapter 17, Part 2. DCI James had been on his way to interview Scott when he'd got the call from the hospital notifying him that Finn was now fully conscious and seemed well enough to manage a short interview. Scott would have to wait. It would do him good to sweat a bit. Knowing that Maddox would want to join in, not to mention the fact that he'd appreciate a break from poring over employment records, he'd called to arrange to meet him at the hospital. The doctor wanted a brief word with James before he interviewed Finn. "He seems pretty well in himself," the doctor said. "Can you believe that when he came round he calmly asked for some paracetamol, as he said he'd got a bit of a headache. He must have the mother of all headaches. At first he couldn't remember what had happened and didn't know why he was in hospital, but as he has slowly gathered his wits, it's all coming back to him. He probably wishes that he was unconscious again. He must feel pretty rough. After about half an hour he asked to speak to the police. I guessed you'd want to speak to him first, so I got the call put to you." James expressed his thanks in a gesture and the doctor continued. "I said that he seems remarkably well, but don't let that deceive you. The brain is a fragile thing, and his has had a pretty bad shaking. You can only speak to him for a limited time. I insist that a nurse be present for the whole interview, and if she thinks the patient has had enough, then you have to stop, no matter how inconvenient it is to you. And if the patient says he's had enough, then that's the final word." James agreed to the terms. What else could he do? The nurse escorted him and Maddox to Finn's room and stood by the door to keep an eye on proceedings. "Are you the police?" asked Finn. "That's right. I understand you asked to speak to us," said James. "However, you must be careful not to overtax yourself. Take your time. We can always come back." "Oh, I'm fine. I've just got a bit of a headache. Though now I come to think about it, I'm not surprised. My throat's sore too." To add meaning to the statement, Finn gingerly felt his neck where signs of bruising still showed. "You're in good hands here, and you'll soon be right as rain," said James. "I gather you particularly asked to see us, so do you mind if I record this conversation? My sergeant here will take notes and ask you to sign them, but my shorthand is shocking, and his handwriting is terrible. It'd take the strain off us all if I could record us chatting." Finn gave his assent and was eager to get talking. He began to recount his tale with plentiful sips of juice to help his sore throat. His vocal cords did sound like they'd had a throttling, but other than the frequent sips, Finn didn't appear to consider it. "At first I didn't know why I was here," he began. "I felt so knocked about and couldn't think why, but then it came flooding back to me." "So why are you in hospital?" asked James. "Because that bloke at the museum strangled me and threw me in the tip." "Which man?" asked James. He pulled a picture of Theo from his profile on the gallery's website onto his mobile and showed it to Finn. Finn shook his head. "No, not him, but I do remember his face." James was confused and found another picture and showed Finn. "Yes, I think that was him." "Was he alone when you were attacked?" "I don't know. I couldn't say for sure. Now, why would this man attack you?" This question stunned Finn, and he suddenly looked confused. However, James wasn't convinced that this amnesia was authentic. James continued to question Finn. "Where have you met him before? You say from the museum, but you don't strike me as an art lover. Why would you see him there?" Finn only responded with silence. "Let me tell you what I do know," continued James. "Maybe that will help you piece things together. I know that you and your pals decided to thrust yourself into the Whitworth Art Gallery and were treated to a private tour. I also know that later that night a painting was stolen from the archives, a cloud study to be exact. It was the sketch that had been pointed out to you only hours earlier. Does this help jog your memory?" Finn looked confused again, but this time it was obviously a feigned confusion. It was a well-practiced closed-off look that had obviously been perfected during many previous interviews with the police, and it indicated that he had nothing further to say. Finn had taken himself down a cul-de-sac and hadn't realised until it was too late where the conclusion of his story would take him. He knew that silence had served him well in the past and was now the only option open to him. James knew better than to keep hammering on this closed door, especially with a vulnerable patient. "Never mind, don't worry yourself about it," said James. "I'm sure things will piece together in good time." Deciding to pick up the threads of a different theme, James changed his tone and casually asked, "What about your friend Scott? Do you see much of him these days?" Finn practically harumphed at the question. "He thinks he's too good for me now he's got in with the posh lot." "I don't know about that. He's proved himself to be a good friend while you've been having a nice little sleep here." Finn looked to question James at this new information. "Oh yes," said James. "Scott has sat by your bedside for hours. The nurses said it would help if you could hear a familiar voice, and so Scott has sat chatting away to thin air for hours on end in the hope that it might bring you back." "He always did witter on when nobody was listening," said Scott. He looked like he was grateful nevertheless. Then remembrance dawned on him. "I remember him sitting here. I tried to tell him what had happened, but I got so confused." Realising again the awkward ground that he was heading toward, he trailed off by mumbling that he couldn't remember any more. Amnesia was a safe haven, and so he resorted to it once again. James could see that the nurse was starting to get fidgety and realised that his time was almost up. "I don't want you to overdo things, but do you feel that you could write a brief line or two explaining a few details of your attack? Just the basics. If you could then sign it, that would be really helpful." Finn said he felt quite up to the task and readily took up the paper and pen that Maddox gave him. "I've written Rick, but I don't know his full name, and I've written what I can remember of the Whitworth when I came to for a short while. It's not a very full description, but it's the best that I can manage," said Finn. "Now you just concentrate on getting better and I'll sort it out. Don't you worry yourself about anything," said James in his best bedside manner. After more reassurance to the patients, James led the way into the corridor. Before Maddox could speak, James gestured for him to stay silent. Without any further clue, James marched to the hospital canteen and bought a coffee for himself and a tea for Maddox, along with several sachets of sugar for his sweet-toothed protégé. Bursting to break the silence, Maddox said, "Well, that's pretty damning. Who'd have thought Rick was capable of murder, or at least attempted murder? I wouldn't have thought him strong enough. It doesn't help us much now, though, does it? I don't think he killed himself." All the tension drained from James. His whole body sagged. "What this gives us is precisely nothing. It's all a mare's nest," said James. "It doesn't matter that some of the details don't add up, some of the timings don't quite work out, because in his present condition, nothing he says is admissible in court. Even then, it's no good at all to us. His brain is completely addled. I know it won't do as evidence, but Finn seems pretty clear about what happened to him, even if he clammed up when it didn't suit him. It does give us some answers, though," said Maddox. James just sadly shook his head and handed Maddox the statement that Finn had written out. Maddox looked at it and couldn't believe his eyes. "Is he taking the mickey?" asked Maddox. "I don't think so. No, I really don't think he is." On the page were a series of meaningless squiggles written with great gusto, but conveying absolutely nothing vaguely recognisable as a letter, let alone a constructed word or sentence. When I asked Finn to check it through and sign it, he didn't seem the least bit embarrassed or fazed. He happily signed it, or at least thought he did. I'm convinced he thinks he's done a good job of it. I know he's not the most academic youth, but he's not so illiterate as that," said James. "What's going on? I have absolutely no idea. We'd better go and ask the doctor." The doctor wasn't surprised in the least. "When I asked you to come, it was primarily for the benefit of my patient, although I knew you'd want to know that he was conscious and see him for yourself. He'd asked to see you, but you already know that anything he says is inadmissible, and you can surely guess that he's bound to be confused, he explained. What about the random scribble? Asked Maddox. It's just another indication that his brain isn't quite firing on all cylinders yet, if it ever will. He may well make a full recovery, eventually. However, as it stands just now, things are still healing. He may honestly think that he's remembered and written a comprehensive account of his experience, but it doesn't mean he's got it right. The brain is an extremely complex organ, but it's childishly simple to explain, said the doctor. While all the neurological pathways are connecting after the shaking the brain took, they're continually firing and misfiring. He'll feel like he can solve all the world's problems and become a mathematical genius into the bargain. It will all seem so glaringly clear as his brain is sparking, but at the same time, he probably won't be able to coordinate his thoughts to tie his own shoelaces. If he can dress himself and put food into his mouth, he'll have made good progress. However, he could be shoving his socks into his mouth, a mashed potato on his feet, and be unaware of his mistake. I've got great hopes that he will make a full recovery, but it will take time. You can't rush the healing process. We just have to keep him comfortable and let his body do the work. The interview was soon over, and Maddox and James stood in the car park mulling over what they'd just heard. So that was an utter waste of time, said Maddox. Quite possibly, but it still had to be done. Perhaps Rick could have been involved. In fact, it's likely that he was. It's just another breadcrumb to pick up along the road. Don't lose heart. We're a formidable team, said James. Brightening up, he turned his attention to other matters. Let's see how an hour or so of waiting has softened Scott. We'll see what he has to say for himself. I'll meet you at the station and we'll give him our full attention. Munro has cleared an interview room for us. Give me half an hour or so and then come in with coffee and smiles. You can play good cop once he's had a bit of the stern side of me. For the full book of Artful Designs, available in paperback or as an ebook, follow the link in the cards in the description box or find details on my website at sharonbill.com. Thanks for listening.